The air in Blackstone Ridge was thick with dust, the kind that settled in your bones. It was the spring of 1887, and the sun hung heavy in the sky, as if the land itself knew the weight of what was to come. In the heart of the town, nestled between the aging storefronts and forgotten saloons, a long wooden warehouse stood like a forgotten relic of the past. The auction had begun. Ellie Hawke stood quietly among the other children, her hands folded in front of her, her thin frame barely visible beneath a tattered shawl. Her eyes, though dark and tired, carried a glint of something sharper, something that suggested she had seen too much for her young age. The wind outside carried the faint smell of cattle and leather, mingling with the dust in the air. She had been sold to strangers before, but today was different. Today, she knew she would be sold again. Ellie had no illusions about her future. The auctioneer's voice rang out, cold and impersonal, as he rattled off the ages and conditions of the children being sold. They were little more than livestock, each one reduced to a number and a price. Some were no more than babies, others barely old enough to hold a broom. And yet Ellie stood apart from the others, her gaze steady and unblinking as she took in every face in the crowd, calculating their intentions. Every auction had a buyer, and every buyer had his own price. The auctioneer's voice grew louder, a rhythm to which Ellie had long since grown accustomed. She had learned to shut out the noise, to ignore the desperate cries and the nervous glances. When your life had been sold once, it was hard to imagine it could be sold again. But Ellie was not afraid. She had learned to survive long before she ever set foot in this town. Next, a girl, age 14. The auctioneer's voice called out, healthy, strong, been working the fields since she was 8, good with animals, can read and write some. Bidding starts at $20. Ellie stepped forward, the sound of her shoes barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. As she ascended the makeshift platform, her ragged dress swayed with each step. Her brown hair, unkempt and tangled, hung loosely around her face, a shadow of the girl she might have been under different circumstances. But it was her eyes that caught the attention of the men watching from the crowd. They weren't the vacant eyes of the other children, eyes that had already given up. No. Ellie's eyes were sharp, calculating, as if she had already figured out the price of every man in this room. A man near the front of the crowd raised his hand. 25, he called, his voice gruff and familiar to Ellie. He was Thomas Briggs, a small-time farmer from north of town, known for working his help near to death. He had bought children like Ellie before, each one barely alive by the time they left his care. The auctioneer's eyes gleamed with greed. 30, he called, but before he could finish, a voice from the back interrupted. 50, Silas Thorne said. The room fell silent. It wasn't the first time someone had bid more than the going price, but $50 was more than most of the children would earn in 2 years of labor. It was an impossible amount. Yet Silas had already made his decision. $50 was a price he was willing to pay, for reasons he couldn't yet explain. The auctioneer, his eyes wide with surprise, turned to the crowd. 50 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 60? There was no response. No one dared to outbid Silas. The auctioneer hesitated for a moment before finally calling out. Sold to Mr. Thorne for $50. Silas moved to the front of the room, his worn boot scraping against the wooden floor. As he reached the auctioneer, he caught Ellie's eye, instead of the gratitude he expected. He saw something else, something dark, pity. The girl who had just been sold like a piece of livestock was looking at him with pity. Silas paused for a moment, something deep inside him stirring. This was no ordinary child. The auctioneer handed him a piece of paper with the girl's details. "Name's Ellie Hawk," he said. "Parents died of fever last winter. She's been living rough ever since. You got yourself a good worker." "Mr. Thorne." Silas folded the paper without a word, his hand brushing against the thin fabric of Ellie's dress. "Miss Hawk," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "I'm Silas Thorne. You'll be coming to work on my ranch." Ellie looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes assessing him as if searching for something. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "What kind of work?" "General help around the house and grounds," Silas replied. "My wife, Miriam, will explain your duties when we get there." "And if I don't want to come?" Ellie asked, the question catching him off guard. He paused. The other children had accepted their fate with resigned silence. But Ellie had the audacity to ask. "You have a choice in the matter," Silas said, his voice even. "But winter's coming, and the streets of Blackstone Ridge ain't kind to young folks on their own." Ellie looked around the warehouse at the remaining children. Their eyes were vacant, their futures uncertain. She turned back to Silas, and something in her expression shifted. It was a subtle change, but enough to make Silas wonder if she had seen something in him, too. "I reckon I'll come with you." Then, "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice flat, as though she had already made up her mind. The ride to Hawk Ridge Ranch took most of the day. Silas had brought his wagon, loaded with supplies from town, and Ellie sat beside him on the bench seat, her hands folded in her lap. The landscape of the Red Bluff Plains stretched out before them, a harsh, barren wilderness dotted with dry creek beds and cracked earth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Silas did not speak much during the journey. He was lost in his own thoughts, the weight of the decision he had just made settling heavily on his chest. He had never intended to buy a child, let alone a girl like Ellie. But something about her had drawn him in, something he couldn't quite explain. Ellie, on the other hand, did not seem to notice the passing scenery. Her eyes were always moving, scanning the land with a quiet intensity. She watched the way Silas handled the horses, the landmarks they passed, and the changing position of the sun. She was not just a child along for the ride. No. Ellie was already planning her escape, already calculating her options. "Planning to run off?" Silas asked, after several hours of silence. Ellie's gaze flickered toward him, but she did not answer immediately. Instead, she stared out at the horizon, as if weighing her response. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Depends." "On what?" Silas asked, unsure where this conversation was going. "On whether you bought me to work, or for other reasons." The steel in her voice made Silas's stomach clench. He pulled the wagon to a halt and turned to face her fully. "Miss Hawk," he said, his voice hardening, "I want to be clear about something. You're coming to my ranch to help with honest work cooking, cleaning, tending the animals. Nothing more. Any man who would harm a child deserves to be strung up, and I include myself in that judgment." Ellie met his gaze for a long moment, her eyes unblinking. Then, slowly, she nodded. "All right." Then, they rode in silence after that, the sound of the wagon wheels creaking in time with the rhythm of the horses' steps. As the sun began to set, they crested a hill, and Ellie got her first look at Hawk Ridge Ranch. The land spread out before them like a small town, a sprawling expanse of rolling hills and open fields. The main house stood at the center of it all, built of sturdy timber with a wraparound porch and dormer windows. A large barn stood to one side, and several smaller outbuildings dotted the property. Cattle grazed lazily in the pastures, oblivious to the arrival of their new companion. "It's bigger than I expected," Ellie said softly. "It took me 20 years to build it up," Silas replied, his voice tinged with pride. "Of course. It'll all belong to strangers when I'm gone, seeing as Miriam and I haven't been blessed with children." Something flickered across Ellie's face at those words, but she said nothing. They descended the hill and made their way toward the main house, where Miriam stood on the porch, waiting for their arrival. "Silas," she called as he climbed down from the wagon. "You're later than I expected." Ellie paused at the doorway, unsure of what to say. Family. The word seemed foreign on her tongue. It had been a long time since she had known what that meant. As she stepped inside the house, the warmth from the fire in the hearth washed over her. The smell of bread and stew filled the air, and for the first time, in a long time, Ellie felt herself relaxing. Just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a start. After dinner, Ellie was shown to a small room off the kitchen. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but it was clean, and it was hers. Silas had already retired for the night, leaving Miriam to prepare Ellie's room. The evening felt quiet, like the calm before a storm, and Ellie lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house. She could hear Miriam moving around downstairs, her soft footsteps echoing up to the room. The air in the room felt different, heavier, as though everything was about to change. There was a part of Ellie that felt the weight of this new beginning, but another part of her, the part that had lived on the streets, the part that had learned to protect herself at all costs, wasn't convinced. She knew what it was like to be sold. She knew what it was like to be used. The rustling of footsteps outside her door made her sit up, her hand instinctively reaching for the worn dress that had once been her only possession. The knock came moments later, gentle but firm. "Ellie." Miriam's voice floated through the door, her tone softer now. "I'll bring you some clothes tomorrow. You should rest." Ellie didn't respond right away. She didn't know what to say. The kindness was foreign to her, and she wasn't sure if she could trust it. After a long moment, Miriam's footsteps faded down the hall, and Ellie's eyes closed, exhaustion finally taking over. "Your family now. This is your home." The firelight flickered in the hearth, casting long shadows against the walls of the small ranch house. Ellie sat at the table, her fingers barely brushing the bread as if she were afraid it might slip away. Her eyes stayed focused on the crackling flames, and the weight of the past seemed to hang over her like a heavy quilt. It had been a long time since anyone had offered her a meal this simple, this genuine. She wasn't used to kindness, and the gesture made her feel strangely out of place, as though she were walking into a room she didn't belong in. The warmth of the house contrasted sharply with the chill that still gripped her heart. She didn't know what to make of this place, Hawk Ridge Ranch, or of the people who had brought her here. Silas Thorne was still a mystery, and though he had promised her that she would only be asked to work, Ellie wondered how long that would last, how long before she became a burden, another face to be forgotten, another child abandoned to the whims of fate. Miriam Thorne had been kind enough to lead her to her room, but there was something in her eyes that Ellie couldn't quite place. The way she had looked at her, both maternal and hesitant, suggested a deeper wound than Ellie could understand. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and the rich, comforting scent of stew. It was a far cry from the rancid stench of sweat and dust that had clung to the air in Blackstone Ridge. Ellie's stomach growled, and for a moment, she thought of the years she had spent scraping by, living off scraps, and the kindness of strangers who weren't always kind. She had always known how to survive. But here, the food was laid out for her, warm and plentiful, and her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a piece of bread. "You're quiet tonight," Miriam said, her voice soft as she watched Ellie from across the table. There was an undercurrent of something in Miriam's voice, something Ellie couldn't quite place. Was it pity, or perhaps a quiet desperation that matched her own? Ellie didn't respond immediately. She had never been good at small talk, not when there was so much left unsaid. Instead, she reached for the stew, ladling some onto her plate, her movements measured and careful, as though she expected the world to suddenly shift beneath her. The silence stretched out between them, heavy and awkward. It was a silence that Ellie had grown accustomed to over the years, one that made her feel like a ghost in someone else's house. But Miriam didn't seem to mind. She continued to watch Ellie with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Are you sure you don't want more?" Miriam asked, her eyes flicking to the bread and then to Ellie's plate. Ellie nodded quickly, not trusting herself to say anything more. Ellie hadn't eaten properly in weeks, and though her body craved the food, her mind was elsewhere. It was as though she were waiting for something to happen, waiting for the other shoe to drop. In her life, things had always gone wrong. She had been abandoned, used, and discarded like so many others. And now that she had found a place that might offer her safety, she didn't know if she could truly trust it. "You're not used to this." "Are you?" Miriam's voice was gentle, almost knowing. Ellie felt a flicker of discomfort at the question. She had never known a life like this. The warmth of the house, the quiet care in Miriam's voice. It was all so new, so foreign. She didn't know how to respond. "I'm not used to much," Ellie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Miriam nodded, her face softening. "I know. It's been hard for a lot of people." She paused, as if considering something, then reached across the table to place a hand on Ellie's. "But you're here now, Ellie, and I'm glad for it. You're safe here." Ellie didn't pull away, but she couldn't bring herself to look at Miriam either. The words were comforting, but they didn't feel real. Safe. How could she be safe when she didn't even know what that meant anymore? The last time she had felt safe, she had been just a child before the streets had taken away everything she had known. Now, the only thing she trusted was herself, and even that felt fragile, like a thread barely hanging on. After dinner, Miriam led Ellie upstairs to a small, simple bedroom. The walls were plain, the furniture sparse but clean. There was a window that overlooked the fields beyond the house, and Ellie could just make out the shape of the barn in the distance. The room smelled faintly of cedar wood, and the bed was covered with a plain quilt, soft and inviting. It was a far cry from the rags she had slept in on the cold, hard ground of Blackstone Ridge, but it made her uneasy all the same. Miriam smiled as she placed a fresh towel and a small bottle of soap on the nightstand. "I'll bring you something better to wear tomorrow," she said. "You've been through enough already." Ellie nodded, though the words felt too heavy in her mouth. She wasn't sure if she had been through enough. Her life had been full of enough hardship to last several lifetimes. But the idea of being cared for, of being seen as something more than a tool to be used, was still a concept she hadn't quite figured out. "Thank you," she said, though she didn't know if she meant it. Miriam smiled softly, as though Ellie's words were all the thanks she needed, after Miriam left the room. Ellie stood by the window for a long time, looking out over the ranch. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of wet earth and fresh grass with it. The world felt quiet here, and though the land was harsh, and the work would no doubt be hard, there was a peace about it, something Ellie hadn't felt in years. But peace was a fragile thing. It could shatter in an instant, like glass falling from a height. Ellie knew that better than anyone. She had survived by trusting no one, by relying on her wits and her ability to stay one step ahead. And though Silas Thorne seemed like an honest man, and Miriam seemed to care for her, Ellie couldn't let her guard down. Not yet. She turned from the window, looking around the room. The bed seemed inviting, but her mind was too restless. She paced slowly, her footsteps light on the wooden floor, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to close her eyes and imagine a life beyond the streets, beyond the auction houses. What would it be like to belong somewhere, to not have to hide, to not have to run? But even as the thought lingered in her mind, something in the distance caught her attention. A flicker of movement outside the window. It was too far to be certain. But Ellie's eyes narrowed, her instincts immediately alert. She had learned to be vigilant, to watch for danger in the smallest of details. Ellie moved to the window, peering into the darkening night. The barn stood quietly against the horizon, but something about the shadows around it seemed off. She watched for a moment longer before the figure disappeared into the dark. A feeling of unease spread through her. Someone had been watching the house. "You're safe here now." The wind howled through the cracks of the barn as Ellie worked late into the night. The flickering lantern casting shadows over the barn's weathered wood. The rhythmic sounds of hooves echoed in the distance as the animals shifted in their stalls. Ellie could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her. But it wasn't the usual silence of a quiet ranch. It was the silence of something lurking just out of sight. She could feel it in the air, in the way the horses stomped their hooves nervously, and the way the wind seemed to carry a whisper that reached only her ears. She had been working for hours, cleaning out the stalls, brushing down the animals, and organizing the hay for the coming morning. It had been a simple day, one that felt like it was meant to distract her from the constant, gnawing unease that had settled in her chest. It was the same feeling she had woken up with this morning, the feeling that she was being watched, that someone or something was waiting just beyond the horizon. The barn, quiet and isolated as it was, seemed to press in around her like a living creature, its creaking wood and rustling hay whispering things she didn't understand. She paused for a moment, wiping her brow with the sleeve of her worn shirt. The evening had cooled, but the air still felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. Her eyes drifted to the far corner of the barn, where shadows stretched long and deep. The lantern's light flickered, casting a faint glow that barely penetrated the darkness beyond. Ellie had grown used to the solitude of the ranch. But lately, things had felt different. There was a sense of unease that had crept into the air, something she couldn't quite name. And it wasn't just the land, it was the people, too. Silas Thorne was a man of few words, and though he had been kind enough to her, there was something about his silence that made Ellie uneasy. Miriam was gentler, more approachable, but there were moments when her kindness felt like an act, a fragile veneer hiding something deeper, something that Ellie couldn't quite understand. She had already noticed how Miriam watched her, how her eyes lingered a little too long, like she was seeing something hidden beneath the surface. Ellie had no illusions about being trusted. She had always been an outsider, even when she had a place to call her own. The streets of Blackstone Ridge had made her that way, guarded, suspicious, always waiting for the moment when the kindness would end and the cruelty would begin. But it wasn't just the people. It was the barn itself, the way it seemed to hum with a kind of quiet, ominous energy. Ellie glanced back toward the corner, her heart beating a little faster. She had heard the sounds of footsteps earlier, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The barn was isolated, just far enough from the main house that no one would hear if something went wrong. Ellie had told herself it was nothing, that it was just the wind playing tricks on her. But the feeling in her gut said otherwise. She picked up the broom and began sweeping the last corner of the barn, the bristles scraping against the wooden floor. It was then that she heard it, the faintest of noises, barely perceptible, a rustle in the shadows. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She set the broom down carefully, her body tense and alert. She wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was out there, just beyond the light. The lantern flickered again, and for a moment, the barn was plunged into darkness. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she reached for the lantern, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of the holder. She lit the wick again quickly, her hands shaking slightly as the light returned to the room. She could see nothing in the shadows, but she could feel the presence there, just out of sight. The hair on the back of her neck prickled, and she swallowed hard, forcing her breathing to slow. She had to stay calm. She had to stay alert. The streets had taught her that. She stepped forward slowly, her boots scraping against the floor, the soft sound of leather against wood the only noise in the barn. She reached the corner, the shadows stretching before her like a dark wall. The air felt colder here, the chill sinking deep into her bones. Ellie didn't hesitate. She stepped into the darkness, her breath catching in her throat as the lantern's light barely illuminated the farthest corner of the barn. There was nothing there. She let out a quiet breath, her heart racing. Just as she turned to step back, something caught her eye, a glint of metal, half hidden behind a stack of hay bales. Ellie's instincts kicked in before she could think, and she moved toward it, her hand reaching out as she pulled the object into the light. It was an old pocket watch, its surface worn and scratched. The gold finish faded with time. The watch felt strange in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her to find it. She turned it over, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the initials engraved on the back, JW. The letters meant nothing to her, but something about the watch felt familiar, as though it had been placed there for a reason. A sudden noise behind her made her spin around, her heart leaping into her throat. But the barn was empty, silent once again, except for the faint sound of the wind outside. The watch slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, its ticking echoing in the quiet room. Ellie stood frozen for a moment, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She bent down to retrieve the watch, her mind racing with questions. Who had left it here? Why had it been hidden in such a way? And why did it feel so important? There was something more to this ranch than Silas had told her. She could feel it, deep in her gut, like a dark secret lurking just out of reach. As she stood, her eyes caught sight of something else, footprints in the dust on the barn floor, leading toward the back door. They were fresh, the edges still sharp from the weight of the boots that had left them behind. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she followed the trail, her mind spinning. Someone had been here recently. Someone who had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. "You're not just a hired girl, are you?" Ellie murmured to herself as she followed the footprints. The storm came without warning. A sudden clash of wind and rain that turned the ranch into a battleground between man and nature. Ellie stood on the porch, staring into the blackened sky, as the first crack of thunder rattled the windows. The air was thick with the smell of rain, wet earth, and something else, something metallic, like the smell of old iron. The ranch house creaked as the wind howled through the trees, and the sky above seemed to groan under the weight of the coming storm. Ellie had always known that the land was unpredictable one moment. It was quiet, and the next. It could change in an instant. It was the same with people. And as she stood there, feeling the chill from the wind biting at her skin, she couldn't help but feel that something was about to change, something that had been waiting, just out of sight, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Behind her, Miriam and Silas were already securing the house, making sure the windows were closed and the doors fastened. Ellie didn't move. She was used to the storm. She had lived through enough to know that when the sky broke open, it was best to keep your distance and wait it out. But this storm felt different, like it was more than just the weather turning. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing, and the air felt charged with energy. The trees were bent sideways, their branches creaking under the pressure. Ellie could feel it, the tension in the land, in the air, and in the house, too. Silas was quiet, his brow furrowed, as though he, too, sensed something was wrong. "You should come inside." "Ellie." Miriam called from the doorway, her voice a mixture of concern and the need to keep things normal. But Ellie couldn't bring herself to move just yet. She stood there, her hand gripping the porch railing, staring at the dark sky. A moment later, a loud crack of thunder shook the ground beneath her feet, followed by the unmistakable sound of hooves in the distance. Hooves, not from the ranch's horses, but from something else, someone else. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts told her that something was wrong, that the storm was not the only threat she had to worry about. She turned and ran toward the barn, her boots pounding on the wet earth. Miriam's voice called after her. But Ellie didn't slow down. She had to know. She had to find out who was coming in the storm. The wind whipped her hair around her face, and the rain started to fall in sheets, blurring her vision. But Ellie pushed on. As she reached the barn, she paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. Listening? The sound of hooves was closer now, the rhythm unmistakable. She could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet as the riders drew nearer. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and for the briefest moment, Ellie saw them figures on horseback, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. They were moving fast, but not in the direction of the main house. No. They were heading toward the edge of the property, near the far corner of the ranch where the cattle grazed. Ellie's pulse quickened. She had no idea who these riders were or why they had come, but her gut told her it wasn't good. And the storm only seemed to make everything more dangerous, more urgent. She pulled open the barn door and stepped inside, where the stalls were empty, the air damp and cold. She paused, gathering her thoughts, trying to figure out what to do. She had to warn Silas, but there was no time to run back to the house. The riders were already too close. Her eyes darted to the shotgun hanging on the wall by the corner, its barrel gleaming faintly in the dim light. Ellie's hand reached out without thinking, wrapping around the cold, worn stock of the gun, She had never used one before, but she knew what it was for. It was for protection, for survival, and right now, survival seemed like the only thing that mattered. With the shotgun in hand, Ellie stepped out into the rain again, the wind buffeting her from all sides. She crouched low behind the barn, moving silently, her heart thumping in her chest as she made her way toward the cattle pens. The riders had stopped now, their horses standing still in the rain, their heads lowered as if they were waiting for something. Ellie's eyes narrowed as she caught a glimpse of one of the figures, a man, his silhouette outlined by the lightning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and he seemed to be scanning the area with a practiced eye. Ellie's heart sank. Jake Cutter. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. She knew him. She remembered him from Blackstone Ridge, a man who had been part of the same criminal world she had left behind. The storm raged around them, the wind screaming as the riders began to move again, heading straight for the cattle pens. Ellie's mind raced. Jake Cutter and his men had come for something. She didn't know what, but it was clear they hadn't come for good. They weren't here to buy cattle or trade supplies. They were here for something else, something darker. Ellie's grip on the shotgun tightened, and her breath came in quick bursts as she stepped forward, closer to the men. She had to stop them. She had to protect the ranch, protect Silas and Miriam. But she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face them. Not alone. The men dismounted, their boots hitting the mud with a soft squelch as they walked toward the pens. Ellie stayed low, keeping her breath steady as she watched them move. Jake Cutter was the first to reach the fence, his hand brushing over the wooden posts as if inspecting the cattle. "You got the girl?" one of the men asked in a low voice, his tone rough. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. They were talking about her. Jake Cutter grinned, the expression wicked and familiar. "She's here somewhere," he said, his voice carrying through the storm. "Just have to find her." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how much time she had before they realized she was there. But she knew one thing: she couldn't wait any longer. "You got the girl." Silence followed the storm's fury, but a new storm was brewing, one far more dangerous than the wind or rain. Ellie stood at the window, gazing out at the wreckage. As she realized her past was no longer a secret, it was coming to find her. The storm had passed, but the damage to the ranch was evident. The wind had knocked over a few of the fences, and the barn door was barely hanging on its hinges. The trees outside were stripped of their branches, their leaves scattered across the ground, despite the destruction. The ranch had weathered the storm as it always did, resilient, unyielding. But for Ellie, the storm had not passed. It was just beginning. She hadn't slept much that night. The shadows from the barn, the figure she had seen in the distance, and the sound of Jake Cutter's voice still echoed in her mind. Zeb Blackstone's men had arrived. Just as Ellie had feared, the ranch was in danger, and Ellie couldn't ignore the deep-rooted fear that had taken root in her chest. The rest of the house was still. Miriam had gone to check on the ranch hands, making sure they were ready to repair the damage done by the storm. Silas was upstairs in his study, no doubt going over the accounts, though Ellie suspected his mind was elsewhere. She couldn't sit still any longer. The unease gnawed at her like a gnawing hunger. Her eyes flicked to the window, where the cattle pens stood, the barn now a skeletal silhouette against the morning sky. That's where they had gone, the men on horseback, the riders she had seen the night before. Jake Cutter and his men had been looking for something, and Ellie was sure they had already found it. With every passing minute, the sense of urgency grew stronger. The ranch wasn't just her refuge anymore. It had become her responsibility. She didn't know what would happen when Silas found out about the men lurking around the ranch, but she wasn't going to let them take it from her, not without a fight. She couldn't wait any longer. Ellie had already made up her mind. The moment she stepped outside, she could feel the crisp air hitting her face. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the property, and the air had that sharp, biting quality that came before something inevitable. Ellie moved quickly across the yard, her footsteps barely making a sound on the wet grass. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she had never been more determined. She reached the barn just as Silas appeared on the porch, his tall figure framed against the light from the house. Ellie froze, her heart racing. He was looking right at her. Silas's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet morning. "Where are you going?" Ellie turned slowly, her mind racing for the right words. She couldn't tell him everything, not yet. He wouldn't understand. She wasn't sure she even understood it herself. "I'm going to check on the cattle," Ellie said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "I heard something last night. The wind was howling, but I think I heard hooves. I just want to make sure the fence is intact." Silas's expression hardened, but he nodded. "Be careful," he said, his eyes narrowing as though he saw through her lie. But for some reason, he didn't stop her. Ellie gave a tight nod before turning back toward the barn. She could feel Silas's gaze on her as she walked away, but she didn't stop. The air seemed to grow thicker as she approached the pens, and Ellie's steps grew heavier, her heart pounding louder with each one. As she reached the fence line, Ellie stopped, her eyes scanning the property. She could see nothing, just the quiet aftermath of the storm, but she knew they were out there, hiding somewhere. Jake Cutter and his men had made it clear that they were looking for someone, and Ellie had no intention of letting them get what they wanted. She turned back to the barn, her mind working quickly. If she could get to the barn loft, she might be able to see them without being noticed. She didn't trust herself to face them directly, not yet. She had no weapons, no backup, only her wits and whatever she could find in the barn to defend herself if it came to that. Ellie made her way inside, her hand brushing against the rough wooden beams as she climbed the ladder to the loft. It was quiet up here, the light filtering in through the cracks in the roof. She peered over the edge, her eyes scanning the yard below. And then she saw them, Jake Cutter and his men, moving toward the far side of the property. They were circling the barn, their eyes sharp, scanning the ground. One of them bent down and pulled up a strip of fabric, Ellie's, torn from her dress the night she had escaped. "She was here," Jake Cutter growled, "and she won't get far." Ellie's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. They were close. Too close. She hadn't realized just how close they had come to discovering her until now. She had to warn Silas. She had to. A sudden noise behind her made Ellie spin around. There, standing in the doorway of the loft, was Miriam. She had a look of quiet concern on her face, but there was something else, too. Something in her eyes that Ellie couldn't quite place. Miriam had seen the tension in her, had noticed the urgency in her movements, and now, here she was, standing silently in the shadows. "You're not going to be able to stop them by yourself," Miriam said softly, her voice barely a whisper over the sounds of the storm. "You know that, don't you?" Ellie froze, her heart racing. Miriam's words hit her harder than she expected. She had been so focused on protecting the ranch, on guarding it against the men who had come for her, that she had never stopped to think that she wasn't alone in this. "What do you mean?" Ellie asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Miriam stepped forward, her face softened by the dim light. "You think you're hiding," Miriam said, pulling something from her coat pocket. A ledger, bound in cracked leather. "They're not just after you. Ellie. This book, it belonged to Zeb Blackstone, and it has your name in it." Ellie's stomach dropped. The truth she had been hiding for so long, was finally coming out. She didn't know what to say, how to explain it. But Miriam didn't wait for an answer. "You don't have to face this alone," Miriam continued, her voice firm. "We'll stand by you. Silas and we've both been through enough, and we'll be damned if we let anyone take what's ours." As the sun dips behind the distant hills, casting its final golden hues across the Hawk Ridge Ranch, the wind stirs the wildflowers along the fence line, their delicate petals brushing against the weathered wooden posts, a quiet reminder of the seasons that have come and gone. The distant sound of hooves echo in the stillness, as though the past has never really left, its stories still riding the wind, carrying memories of those who once walked this land, and the ones who are still finding their way. The land, though unyielding in its ruggedness, offers something more peace, a peace that is born not from the absence of storms, but from the resilience forged through them, and in the stillness that follows. There is the faintest trace of twilight, that hour when the world softens, and the weight of things undone begins to rest upon the heart, reminding us of all that was left unsaid, yet deeply understood. In the echo of the barn door closing, the crackling of a fire, and the occasional whisper of the old letters that have been passed from hand to hand. A story is not just told, but remembered. The old winds carry the names of those who have passed on, and their legacies live on not in monuments or grand gestures, but in the quiet strength of those who remain. And though the roads have twisted and turned, bringing both joy and pain, justice may come late, but it does come, in the form of a woman who was forgotten by the world, but never by the land. Ellie Hawk, who once had no name but that of a laborer, became the heartbeat of a place that gave her the chance to be something more than what the world had decided for her. Silas and Miriam, bound by their own burdens and regrets, found in her not a servant, but a daughter, a woman who carried with her the truth that the land had long been hiding, a truth that, though buried for many years, was never lost, only waiting to be uncovered by someone willing to listen to the wind, to the silent prayers whispered in the night, to the echoes of past mistakes and hidden kindness. It is a truth that shows us that honor may be buried in the dust of forgotten towns, but it is never erased. The wind may blow over a lonely grave, but it still remembers the stories etched in the dirt. The heart may break and be torn by time, but it still beats for something greater, something worthy of the struggle. Ellie's redemption, the turning of a life once sold into something priceless, reminds us that justice, though delayed, still matters. It may not come in the form we expect, nor on the timeline we hope for, but in the end, the heart will have its reckoning, and the wrongs will find their way home. The cattle ranch that was once a symbol of loneliness and regret became a sanctuary, a place where the forgotten were not only seen, but cherished. Through a simple act of kindness, a woman who had been abandoned by the world, who had no claim to a name or a place, became the soul of something greater than herself, a legacy, a family. A new generation that would learn what it meant to stand tall in the face of a world that had long since given up on them. And in the quiet of that final night, when the fire burned low and the stars above seemed to whisper secrets of old, Ellie knew that the truth she had carried with her all this time, the truth of survival, of forgiveness, of belated justice, was no longer hers alone. It belonged to the world, to the land, to those who would remember and carry it forward. As the night grew darker, the wind through the trees carried with it a message that told us to remember that even the quietest hearts, the ones that are broken and bruised, have a place in the world, for sometimes those who have nothing left to lose are the ones who can give the most. And those who have known the bitterness of the storm are the ones who can teach us the most about how to endure. So, as the old stories fade into the silence of the land, let us carry them forward in our hearts, and when the winds howl and the cattle roam, may we remember that there is always room for one more story, one more truth to be told, one more voice to be heard, one more act of kindness to be passed along, if you believe in honor, justice, and the forgotten ones who deserve more than the world has offered them. Then remember this story. Remember Ellie Hawke, who gave everything to ensure that the legacy of kindness would survive. And if you find yourself in need of another story, another reminder of what it means to carry on, subscribe to Westwind Whispers and join us again. If this story has touched you, if you believe in the power of redemption, type 1 to leave your mark and share the quiet truth of this place with others. For as long as we remember, the old winds will carry the story forward, and we will be here to tell it again.